Good afternoon. I see some of you are still getting something to eat. We're going to go ahead and start the luncheon keynote session. So good afternoon to 2019 Equity and Diversity Conference attendees and those joining us via live stream. We haven't done this in a while, live streaming our keynote. I'm Shani Barracks-Moore, UNT Director of Diversity and Inclusion and co-chair of the 2019 UNT Equity and Diversity Conference Planning Committee. Some of you may be just joining us for our luncheon keynote address with Howard J. Ross, addressing our theme, Beyond the Surface, Examining Implicit Bias, and we welcome you all. But first, I have the distinct honor of welcoming our UNT President, Dr. Neil Smatresk, who's joining us this year for the 2019 Equity and Diversity Conference. Dr. Smatresk?
Thank you, Shani. Well, good afternoon. A full house. I was just saying, you know, I give a speech and not half this many people come, so this is obviously a really important and timely topic. It's great to be here, and this annual conference is one of the most important and popular things that we do through the year. So I think you're in for a treat. In fact, it hit full capacity over weeks ago. We might have to find a bigger venue next time or limit the seating. I appreciate you all taking time to investigate and learn about Beyond the Surface, investigating implicit bias. We all have biases. It's a natural thing. Learning how to manage, handle, be open are critical parts of our growth as people. And one of the reasons I'm particularly excited about this is because we've been having a lot of talks lately about our brand as a university, who we are as a university. And the word that surfaces in every group I meet with, in every faculty group, in every student group, is that we're a caring community. And the caring word seems a little bit like a throwaway word. What university would say they don't care? None. But I've been to a lot of places in my life, and I've never felt that sense of inclusion, that sense of caring, more than I felt it here. I love our community. I think more than any place I've been, we pull together, we celebrate our students, we work hard for each other. Our caring changes us, and when we care for other people, it changes them, and when we care about the world around us, it can change the world. So, as an element of that caring, it's always better to scratch the surface and see what lies underneath, and that's what you're going to hear about today, because ultimately this will benefit us and our students. For all of you, thanks for your commitment. Thanks for being here and actually being part of the front lines of people who are going to go out there and help to make a difference and to remind our community just how much we all matter to each other. So with that, I know you're all eating, and I'm glad we have plastic forks, so I'm not fighting the clink of silverware. But I encourage you to both enjoy your lunch, enjoy the hospitality of our university, tour around a little bit, and except it's really, really cold out there, and so it's not quite as hospitable as it might be on a nice warm spring day. But enjoy your time and the sessions that you're going to be participating in. And we do have a little bit of a basketball game tonight. I encourage you all to show up. It would be great, especially those of you who aren't from the university. It's a big time game because, hey, we get to celebrate on the court as well as off the court around here. And I'll leave you with my favorite 3 words. Go Mean Green. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smatresk. We're so glad that you could join us today. Now I'm extremely excited to introduce our next guest, with whom I've had the pleasure of working since last summer. So I was introduced to Rob Tharp by David Broughton, our partner in UNT Advancement, who's quite frankly responsible for all the external partnerships and sponsorships we've received for our Equity and Diversity Conference since last year. David, where are you? Could you stand? David, could you please stand and be properly thanked? I warned him that I was going to embarrass him, so he knew that was coming. As David and I were thinking of ways to encourage people to participate in UNT's first ever Campus Inclusion Climate Survey, we knew that incentives have a way of encouraging people to participate. He said, you know, I think I know someone who might be interested in this. And we went to meet Rob Tharp, General Manager at Honda of Denton. I won't bore you with all the details, but let's just say that Rob was happy to support our efforts to make this historic effort for UNT a success. Rob donated a 2018 Honda Civic LX with taxes and fees included as an incentive for students completing the Campus Inclusion Climate Survey. Is that not awesome? Yes, hand for that. So today we get to properly thank him for UNT's Campus Inclusion Climate Survey having the highest participation rates of any other institution who used the Viewfinder survey tool. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Rob Tharp, General Manager for Honda of Denton, who will present this wonderful gift to our UNT Student Climate Survey Incentive winner, Yuritsa Hernandez.
Thank you. I'm honored, humbled. Shani Moore really is the architect behind this. I just get to take a little bit of the credit. But I will tell you that growing up in a multicultural environment, I shared a unique lens, I guess you could say, that transcended into our business model, which has been the fabric of Honda of Denton. And so with that, I will tell you, we've had a lot of success with that formula. And we continue to incorporate that today. It's interesting because I had someone that said, Rob, you guys have had a lot of success. So really, who's your right-hand guy? And I said, well, my right-hand guy is Amelia Ballard. So if you would stand up. So everybody just give her a round of applause. So with that, I will tell you that it developed something for University of North Texas. If you bring your student ID, when you come into the service drive, you get 20% off service, and then obviously if you bring your student ID in to purchase a new car, then you will get employee pricing from here forth and moving forward. So that's just something we want to do to give back. But again, we are very grateful. We're grateful for the opportunity again, and we do have a little bit of news about the car. Yuritsa, I hate to tell you this, but we have some changes on the car. We sold out of the 2018, so now you get a 2019. With that being said, would you like to come out? Yuritsa Hernandez, folks. Congratulations. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Anything else? Are you sure? Okay, all right. You want to hang on to this?
We'll give it to you. Well, yay. Thank you again, Rob, and congratulations, Yuritsa. You have some luck, girl. I need some of that. Okay, now everyone feels good, right? And I think we have let in some folks who were hoping for an extra seat into our keynote, so we are going to go ahead and continue with our program. So just a reminder that you'll be able to tweet questions for our keynote speaker, Howard J. Ross, using the hashtag EDC @UNT. This also goes for those of you watching on live stream. We'll begin with some tweeted questions after his address from our social media team led by Alex Sylvester to pose a few of your questions. Say hi, Alex.
Hi, I'm not just for the fire alarm. I do this too.
Great. So that will give those of you time to line up at the microphones that we have. There's one over there, and then there's one over there, to pose questions for Howard Ross, and perhaps those of you who did not get a chance to finish your lunch or getting your lunch to do so. So now for our introduction of Howard J. Ross. So Howard Ross is a lifelong social justice advocate and the founder of Cook Ross, a consulting firm providing solutions to organizations around the world in the areas of diversity, inclusion, cultural competency, leadership development, and organizational change management. He is considered one of the world's seminal thought leaders on identifying and addressing unconscious bias. Howard authored the Washington Post bestseller, Everyday Bias, Identifying and Navigating Unconscious Judgments in Our Daily Lives, and Reinventing Diversity, Transforming Organizational Community to Strengthen People, Purpose, and Performance. Many of you already received his new book, Our Search for Belonging, How the Need for Connection is Tearing Our Culture Apart, which will be available for purchase and signing immediately after his keynote at 2 p.m. Howard has delivered programs in 47 states and over 40 other countries carrying out the work of Cook Ross. His audience has included hundreds of Fortune 500 companies and major institutions within healthcare, government, and nonprofit sectors, in addition to a variety of other industries. He's led programs at Harvard University Medical School, Stanford University Medical School, Johns Hopkins University, the Wharton School of Business, Duke University, Washington University Medical School, and over 20 other colleges and universities. From 2007 to 2008, Howard served as the Janetta B. Cole Professor of Diversity at Bennett College for Women. Any North Carolinians in here? Yes, Bennett College, yay, that's right. At Bennett College for Women, the first time a white man had served in such a position at a HBCU, or a historically black college and university. He's been published by the Harvard Business Review, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Fast Company Magazine, Diversity Woman Magazine, Forbes Magazine, Fortune Magazine, and has been a regular guest on National Public Radio for more than 10 years. In acknowledgement of his significant contributions, Howard was the recipient of the 2009 Operation Understanding Award for Community Service, the 2012 Winds of Change Award from the Forum on Workplace Diversity and Inclusion, the 2013 Diversity Peer Award from Diversity Woman Magazine, the 2014 Catalyst Award from Uptown Professional Magazine, and the Catalyst for Change Award from Wake Forest University, another North Carolina school, and the 2016 Leadership in Diversity Award by the World Human Resources Conference in Mumbai, India. Howard received his Bachelor of Arts in History and Education from the University of Maryland and completed postgraduate work in Leadership and Management at Wheelock College. Please join me in giving a Mean Green UNT welcome to our 2019 Equity and Diversity Conference keynote speaker, Howard J. Ross.
Thanks so much, Shani. You know, when you get really old, the introduction gets longer and longer. And my father would have loved that introduction. My mother would have even believed some of it, so I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be with you, and I'm going to jump right in. I want to warn you, I talk fast. My dad came from the Bronx, and so it's kind of in my blood. So if you listen fast, we can get more done in the same period of time, okay? But I do realize I do that, so we'll go. So what I really want to focus on today is what's going on around us. It's already been mentioned earlier, you know, we're in this place now where we feel like we're in a cold civil war. And that's not news for anybody. All you need to do is watch the news the last couple of days, and you see how we already decided, before the hearings even started yesterday, how we were going to react to the hearings, right? I mean, almost nobody went into those hearings without bias because we already knew there were those of us who thought, well, you know, he's now going to expose these things that we want exposed, and there were those who already thought, well, everything he's going to say is a lie. Talking about Michael Cohen, of course. You know. So what I want to do with you, with the short time I have, is to break this down a little bit and to look at it, how it is as human beings we're making these choices and how it's affecting us, and most importantly, what it is we can do about them. And we know, by the way, this is not just local. You know, we know what's going on in the UK with Brexit. In Northern Europe, you've got all kinds of countries that that for a long time have considered themselves the most socially liberal countries in the world who are now banning people's religious dress. We know that in India, people are being lynched by extreme right-wing Hindus for eating beef, for example. And even in Costa Rica, oh, actually, this picture switched, sorry. Even in Costa Rica, which is where we usually go to get away from this nonsense, they had an anti-immigrant riot not long ago. So all of this is happening. The sense of tribalism is occurring all around us. And we know that at its core, tribalism is fed by fear. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain science behind this a little later. But we know that what happens is once we're gripped by fear, that fear grips up. It's a little bit like I was in Malaysia a number of years ago doing some work, and they took us to this place where they catch monkeys for medical research. And in this particular area, there are a lot of these monkeys. And the way they do it is fascinating. They take a clay bowl with an opening that's big enough so that the monkey can squeeze their hand in, and they put them into the ground. So all that's showing is the hole. And inside of the clay pot, they put wild cherries, which the monkeys like to eat. So the monkey squeezes his hand into the pot, grabs the wild cherries, but once he's made a fist, can't get his hand out of the pot. So the monkeys are actually sitting there on the ground trying to fight to get their hands out of the pot. The people come over, throw a net over them, dig the pot up, break the clay pot, and then they have the monkey captured. So the question I would ask is, when the monkey's hand is in the pot and they've got the cherries, does the monkey have the cherries or do the cherries have the monkey? You know, and I would say that for some of us, the same thing is true from the standpoint of where we are around these issues. You know, we get stuck in being right, in being righteous. The ends justify the means. And of course, demonization and stereotyping and bias of people on the other side. Now, we of course know that they're doing it to us, whichever us we are, by the way, because I'm not assuming we have universal political ideology in this room. But it's a lot harder to see when we're stuck in the same trap. And that's what I really want to take apart a little bit. So I want to start just by talking a little bit about bias and how it plays itself out. We've had over 1,500 studies in the last 10 years alone about how human bias shows up in virtually every aspect of human identity. I mean, I could give you, if you give me an aspect of human identity, I promise you I could point you to a study. It's become so much data that it's almost hard to absorb it all. But just a couple to get us started. This study was done by a woman named Erin Reeves in Chicago. She sent out a memo to law firm partners that was supposedly, this memo was supposedly written by a young lawyer named Thomas Meyer, but alternatively, the participants in the study were told that Thomas Meyer was either white or black. When they were told that he was white, they rated the memo 4.1 out of 5, found on average about 10 errors, and they said things like he has potential, good analytic skills, generally is good writer, but needs to work on such and such. When they were told the exact same memo, word for word, was written by Thomas Meyer, but he was black, his grade dropped to 3.2, a full letter grade in academic parlance, and they found 40% more errors. And this Thomas Meyer needs a lot of work, average at best. I can't believe he went to NYU. Now for me, the first number is obviously important because we get evaluated and that impacts our careers. But the second number is maybe even more illustrative. Why would we find 40% more errors in the same document? Well, the answer is simple, and a quote from Goethe, the great German philosopher: we see what we look for and we look for what we know. Everybody in this room, I'll bet, has somebody in your life whose competence is so established for you that if they hand you a document and ask you to look through it, you glance at it, right? And then somebody else hands you that exact same document, you don't know them as well, and you take out the red pen. You know, and so we know this plays itself out. We know it plays out in gender as well. At Yale University, they did a study where they gave science professors a resume for a potential lab assistant, and this time the breakdown was by gender. Once again, everything exactly the same except for the first name, which was either alternatively John or Jennifer. When it was John, it was rated 4 on a scale of 7, Jennifer only 3.3. John on average was offered $4,000 more per year in salary. He was also seen as more likely to hire. But interestingly enough, female professors rated them almost exactly the same as male professors. Now, why would that happen? Well, of course, we're all exposed to the same stereotypes. You know, who's depicted as science people? You know, now we're starting to see some change in this, but more and more we know that in the STEM areas, you know, in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that this is a real issue, and it's one of the things that dissuades young girls from getting into these topics. We know something happens when girls are about 12, 13 years old, that up to that time girls outperform boys in all of those areas. But at that point, it starts to shift. And what people now believe is part of that is, at that stage of my life is when I'm starting to look at what I might do for a living. And if I don't see a lot of role models like me out there, I'm inclined to put my attention in other directions. It has nothing to do with competence. It has nothing to do, no matter what Larry Summers says, with the way their brains are developed. In another study in University of Wisconsin, they found that 4 times as many cautionary comments were found in margins of tenure packages when they had women's names associated with them. So comments like, we'd have to see her job talk, or it's impossible to make such a judgment without more information, or I need to see evidence that she's gotten these grants and publications on her own. Things that never showed up, or very rarely showed up when it was men. So I could go on and on, but we get the point. We make these determinations, and the same mental process that has us make these determinations is the process that has the police officer pull the trigger of the gun. It's the same thing that has us inclined to hire or like this person versus that person. This is what we do as human beings. We make these judgments. If you have a brain, you're biased. So what is bias? You know, how many people, when you hear the word bias, think something negative? Right? Yeah, this is what most of us feel because we've been trained in this bias equals badness paradigm. But in actuality, bias is not inherently either positive or negative. It's simply a function of our brain. It's a tendency or inclination that results in judgment without question. It is automatic. And it's also a shortcut to interact with the world. And I can put it in terms that have nothing to do with people just to see why the brain does this. The brain uses far more of our energy, of our bodily energy, than it should, given its size, because it's so important to us, obviously. And so we're designed to try to conserve that energy. We're designed to move things quickly. So let's say, for example, I'm walking across this, you know, I can very easily walk across this stage because I've been on stages like this before and I know this will hold my weight. But let's say that wasn't always true. Let's say that I had been on the stage before where there was a trap door or one of the panels was loose and when I stepped on it, I fell through to the floor. Now, how might I walk the next time? It would probably look something like this, right? Because I don't want that to happen to me again. And so this is kind of the way the brain works. We make these quick assessments. Now, how does it show up for people? I look at this person out there and I make a quick guess what this person is likely to be like based on my previous experience of people like that or what I've been told about people like that. Now, that's really an important distinction because we know, for example, that the more we interact with people on a personal level who are different from us, the more our bias tends to decrease. The more we know each other for who we are, we might say, the less we treat each other like what we are. Interestingly enough, the highest levels of racial bias in our country are in the areas of our country where there's the least racial diversity. Just as an example, the state of Montana a few years ago passed an anti-Sharia law in the state of Montana. They had 7 Muslim immigrants in 5 years. Now, you got to figure those are pretty impressive people to have them form an entire law. But it just shows you how irrational that we can be about this. Because at the heart of it is the realization that we've come to over the last 20 years that we're not rational as human beings. We think we are, but we're actually rationalizing. We actually gather data to support what we already believe. Said another way, we don't think the way we think we think. So let me give you a couple examples of what I mean inside of this question, how much do we really know? Watch the screen.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Don't believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so.
Now, how many of the intelligent, educated, successful people in this room saw more than a few changes in that video? You know, I see a spattering of hands around. because it has nothing to do with intelligence. What it has to do with is where we're looking. We all have a tendency to focus on certain things and miss others. Psychologists call this inattentional blindness or selective attention. You know? And it shows up every day, doesn't it? How many of you have been in a meeting where somebody does something or says something, not I mean overt usually, but more subtle, you know, maybe a micro behavior, you know, either a micro advantage of somebody or a micro inequity or microaggression, whichever language you particularly use. You know, how many people have had that happen and you walk out and you say to somebody, did you see that? And they say, no, what are you talking about? Just raise your hand if that's ever happened to you. Yeah. Now our tendency is when we see that to say, well, you should have. But the truth is we see very little of what's around us because we see the world shaped by our experience. And that experience gives us distinctions to look for that other people not see. Now, you know, for example, my wife is an artist and I'm a musician. I sang lead in rock and roll bands for 30 years. So we're listening to a piece of music and she says, wow, this is a great song. But I'm listening for how the bass picks up the drum beat or how the voices come together. You know, we go to an art museum and she looks at a painting and she says, wow, look at the splatter effect and the colorization and the shadowing here, and I'm a pretty picture. And each of you know that. This is why you study a particular field, because you want to get the distinctions that make you good at that particular field. You guys know more about cars than I'll ever know, because that's your field. You have to have those distinctions in order to do your job. And we could go around the room and figure out how that's happening. So what we see is conditioned by what we know. Now, who do you think is more likely to see dynamics of an identity group? I mean, race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever we choose. People who are in the dominant or the non-dominant group. Non-dominant, of course, because those of us who are in the dominant group don't have to pay so much attention to those distinctions because the culture is built around our way of being. If you're a woman in a predominantly male environment, you better be watching out for distinctions of gender because those are the landmines you have to watch out for. If you're a person of color in a predominantly white environment, the same is true. And this is one of the challenges we have because somebody comes to me and says, did you see this? I say, well, I didn't see it, meaning if I didn't see it, it's not there, where actually what it means is I didn't see it because my lens doesn't allow me to see it. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to have diversity in our lives. Because if we create relationships with people, we can get the view from another side. And there's lots of research. One person, notably Scott Page, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, have proven that people who have diverse teams and perspectives produce better results, find better solutions to problems, find more alternative solutions to problems, all of those kinds of things. Right? So all this is happening in terms of what we see, but it's not just what we see, it's what we hear as well. So I'm going to do a little experiment with you. I'm going to divide the room right in half here, and everybody on this side of the room, in just a moment, I want you to close your eyes. I won't let them take your stuff, okay? Folks, on this side, I'd like you to keep your eyes open and watch the screen, and I'm going to play a 5-second video and ask you what you hear, okay? So close your eyes over here. Here we go. Ba, 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 ba. Good, so open your eyes. So if you heard ba, ba, please stand up. Now look around the room. Okay, you can sit down. If you heard da, da, or ga, ga, please stand up. Sometimes a little L will come in too. La, la might come in, yeah. Interesting. All right, you can sit down. I'm going to play it again, and this time you can open and close your eyes. You'll actually hear it change right before your eyes. Ba, 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 ba. Now, aside from being way cool, what does this teach us? You know, we actually hear with our eyes more than we realize. In this case, the reason it's happening is because the voiceover actually is saying ba, ba. You actually heard what was being played. But the image is of him saying ga, ga, and over here, most people automatically read lips without even realizing it. And so you have to process the visual and the sound image. Now, and usually it turns into a D or a G sound, right? Fascinating, right? But this shows up lots of different places in our lives and lots of different reasons. When I was teaching at Bennett, for example, I was having lunch one day with the president of the college in her office and 3 other people. And Bennett is a Methodist school in the South, so they pray over everything down there. And, you know, we closed our eyes and somebody said a prayer. And of course, it was a Christian prayer and evoked Jesus. And I'm Jewish. Now, I wasn't offended by that. My wife grew up in a Christian home. But it brings it up to awareness. And we open our eyes. The person next to me turns to the person next to him and says, by the way, we also have Jews here. And I thought to myself, that was a nice attempt on his part to be inclusive until she responded by saying, no, water's fine, thank you. Juice. He said juice, right? But because I was sensitized to that, what did I hear? Now, everybody in this room has had an example of something like that. You expected somebody to say something, and even though they were saying something completely different, you heard it anyway, right? You know? But it also shows up in practical decisions people make in business, for example.
He's the boss, she's bossy. the negative way women are perceived at the office in a new ad for Pantene that's gone viral. Going nowhere. It's hit a nerve, so we set out to find the truth. Are women who act exactly the same as men seen differently? Listen to this woman. How do you feel about her as a job candidate?
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
Now, listen to him.
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
The candidates in these videos are actors in a Yale University hiring experiment. The resumes, identical. The interviews, identical.
I'm extremely good
at sizing up people quickly and then delegating responsibility accordingly.
The only difference is gender. But when it comes to who got the job,
I thought the male applicant had better soft skills.
I'd say the woman was arrogant and overselling.
In hundreds of evaluations, the female job seekers come off as more aggressive, are rated less likable, and they're less likely to be hired.
Isn't it a catch-22? You're supposed to be strong to get that job, and you're saying if you're too strong, you won't get it.
You need to behave in this dominant way to advance as a woman in the workplace, but you're seen negatively because that's not how we expect women to behave.
And if you think this is just male bias, it's not. Both men and women doing the hiring made the same call.
I think there's a level of arrogance that might be okay to be a manager, but then there's a step above, and I thought she was slightly above that.
So let's talk. And when we revealed our study results,
I was surprised by my reaction.
What does that say about us?
We have a long way to go.
Yes, indeed we do. And of course, this dynamic that we saw in this very specific focus shows up anytime human beings react. It shows up when professors decide how to grade students. It shows up when students decide how to evaluate professors. It shows up when we decide who to work together, who's be a prime person for a promotion. I could go on and on, but really anytime human beings interact, these are the dynamics we're dealing with. And some of you have lived through these circumstances yourself. You know, we might say that our brains seem to evolve to be good enough most of the time. We're making guesses for the most part because we don't have all the information. Our brain takes the history and the circumstance and fills in the blank to predict what is the more likely circumstance to be occurring here. Sometimes that can be really helpful when it clues us in real quickly to watch out for that person who actually is dangerous. Sometimes it can be fatal when somebody says that person is dangerous but they're not, and a police officer, for example, pulls a trigger. So it can go in either direction. The phenomenon itself is not good or bad, but the way it plays out is important. Now, one way this plays out is through projection. You know, we see something or somebody, and we make something up about that person. So let me give you an example. I want you to imagine that you've got a grown son or daughter, and they call you one day and they say, "Mom, Dad, I'm in love. I found the guy of my dreams. We're going to live together forever. We're going to get married. I can't wait for you to meet him. We're coming home next month." Well, you can't wait either, so you go on their Facebook page. And you find them on that Facebook page with two men, this one or this one. Who are you hoping for? Right. The guy on the left, by the way, who's 6'10", 300 pounds, is named John Fetterman. He was recently elected lieutenant governor of the state of Pennsylvania. He, previous to that, was a mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, has a master's degree in public policy from Harvard, served in AmeriCorps, and did an amazing job of transforming the old steel town that he lived in into a thriving community that he was reelected twice, the last time with over 70% of the vote, and as I said, recently elected a lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. The guy on the right is Ted Bundy, the serial killer. Right. This is what I think. We make stuff up about people, you know? How does this picture viscerally hit you until you see the rest of it? Whoops, I'm sorry. Until you see the rest of it. You know? Who are these 5 women? Anybody know? 5 United States astronauts. Is this a militia initiation? No, these are 2 men getting married the first day of marriage equality in the state of Washington. This is the way the mind works. We see each other and we make stuff up about people. You did that when I walked up on the stage. You already had an impression of me, positive or negative, maybe wondering who the hell I was to be speaking about diversity anyway as this big white guy. You know, and but you know, whatever it is, this is what we do as human beings. We make these quick guesses, but if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. And usually the first one, we screen out foe before we get to friend. Because if you think about it, if you were to create a brain and evolve it over thousands of years, would you have it evolve to be more likely to be sensitized to threat coming your way or reward? Threat, of course, because if you miss reward, nice surprise, you miss threat, dead. So we're highly sensitized to threat coming our way. We tend to see the negative in people and have to clear it out before we can engage. It takes about 20% more brain power, more glucose, blood flow, et cetera, to relate positively than negatively in that regard. And so we can look at the neurobiology of this because we know that we don't always think the way we think we think. I know the English people here will kill me for that sentence, but I like it anyway. So we know in very quick terms how this happens. We see something out there in front of us. I call it some catalyzing person or circumstance, and we see it through the background of our experience. That filters what we see. So let's say, for example, let's see. I'll make up somebody. I meet this woman, Barbara, and she's, I meet her and I have this first sense, something about this woman makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't even realize that what actually happened was I flipped back 50 years in my life. When I was a kid, when I was in middle school, we used to have sock hops because in those days they didn't have polyurethane for the gym floor. They had shellac and they were protecting it, so we danced in our socks. And of course, in those days, there weren't any gay people around. You know that, right? 50 years ago, they weren't, Y'all have just come into the surface, really, just the last couple. So everything was assumed to be heterosexual. The boys would line up on one side of the room, the girls on the other in the gym, and it was always our job, the boys, to ask the girls to dance. So this was my big moment. Let's say, I'm just making this up, but let's say it was my big moment to ask this girl, Sally, who I had a crush on, to dance. And so with all my courage, I walked boldly across the gym, and in front of all of my friends and the whole school, I asked her to dance, and not only does she say no, but she laughs at me. And so then I have to take the walk of shame back. And the whole time I'm saying to myself, what? I am never doing that again. Flash forward 50 years and I meet Barbara. Barbara is wearing the same color jacket that Sally was wearing. And in my brain, in the unconscious part of my brain, in the limbic system, the fast brain, that color jacket and rejection are linked. Now, I'm not aware of this consciously, but it's like E4 gets pressed on my little personal jukebox and that song begins to play. Watch out. Now, of course, this happens with stereotyping all the time. I meet somebody on the street who's of a particular racial group, a particular gender group, whatever identity group, and my brain immediately goes to, what do I know about people like them? So the amygdala picks up the signal, the fear center of the brain picks up the signal, we run to the hippocampus, the filing cabinet, the memory center, and say, this reminds me of that person, and if that's positive, oh, hi. If it's negative, hi. Or walk across the street the other way. Now, and when we have groups of people, let's say African American men, for example, who are bombarded with negative stereotypes, it's much more likely to happen. When it's somebody like us, it's less likely to happen because we tend to, there's this phenomenon psychologists call the out-group homogeneity effect. We tend to make people in groups outside of us, we tend to assume that they're more the same. So our fast brain, in making these decisions, can lead us to make some really questionable decisions. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with people. This is an advertisement for subscription to The Economist magazine. You have three choices, $59 for an online subscription, $125 for paper, or $125 for both. What a bargain. We love a bargain. We're completely hooked by bargains, so 84% of the people choose the last option. So some folks at Duke University said, well, nobody chose the middle choice anyway, so let's take it out and see what happens. What do you think happens now? Almost completely reverses. Because you see, nobody really needed the paper, they just couldn't turn away a deal. This is associative marketing. This is why Madison Avenue can hook us so easily. You know who's brilliant at this? Watch Subaru commercials. People with puppy playing in the sandbox with little children, dog playing frisbee in the backyard, dog running next to the river, old dog with gray whiskers in the back of the car. Subaru. They don't even tell you anything about the car. You don't even know what the commercial is until the last frame. Because they're not selling you a car, they're selling you puppy love, and then they're glomming it onto the car. Now, people have done this forever, of course. Breasts and beer, breasts and cigarettes, breasts and anything. And we get hooked by it, like a fish. We react viscerally to it. Now, we do have the capacity in the prefrontal cortex, this amazing part of the human brain, 4 to 5 times larger than any other animal per body size, and 4 to 5 times more active. This is where we can watch ourselves. This is where we get metacognition. We can say, what made me think that way? You see, that's where the power, that's where we begin to take control of our lives, when we develop more metacognition. I can show you the relationship between the two. So I'm going to show you a series of letter combinations. Some are words and some aren't. Ignore that. All I want you to do is speak out loud the color of the font that you see on the screen, okay? So let's try one. Okay, good. Here we go. We're going to go fast. Okay, good. Pretty easy, right? Let's do it again. Here we go. Well, you feel that tug of war? That tug of war that you just felt in your brain is a tug of war between your fast and your slow brain. I gave you a very simple fast brain instruction. You had no problem with it. The second time you gave yourself, a slow brain instruction, you gave yourself a fast brain instruction that you've been learning since you were 3 years old, which is letters make words. And the fast brain is like the older sibling of the slow brain. It's been around about 100 million years longer from an evolutionary standpoint, and it's survival oriented. So all of you who said "rrr" or red before you said green, that's what your brain had you do. Now, we can laugh at it here, but how does this impact us when I've got this professor coming in? She's an African-American woman, and my job is to interview her. And I am thrilled because she's got an incredible resume. And maybe even it's more than just being a professor. She's going to be a leader. She's going to be an associate dean or a dean or something like that. And I'm looking at this resume. I can't wait. And I mean, I genuinely feel this way because it's great that we have more women of color coming into leadership positions, right? But at the same time as I'm interviewing her, my fast brain is comparing her to other leadership models I've seen, to other people who've been leaders. And what did they look like? Probably this. So culturally, she's a little bit different. She doesn't have that executive presence, whatever that gaseous quality is that we can never get quite our hands around, you know. She just doesn't feel to me as much of a leader because culturally and gender-based and for lots of other reasons, her normative behavior is different than what I expect in a leader, what I'm used to in a leader. So it happens, and the next day Joanne says to me, well, what do you think? And I say, bright, capable, probably, but, I just didn't feel it. And I have no idea that I'm contributing to that conversation. And this is the nature of how we relate. Now, I talked before about the fact that we divide each other, that we choose us versus them. So I want to move in that direction a little bit. I want to start by telling you what's been called by some the funniest religious joke ever told. Okay? This was a joke by a guy named Emo Phillips. So the joke goes, a guy runs up to a guy on a bridge. The guy's about to jump. He runs up. He says, don't jump. Why are you going to jump? The guy says, nobody loves me. So the rescuer says, God loves you. Do you believe in God? He says, yeah, I believe in God. He says, good, so do I. He says, what denomination are you? The rescuer says. And the guy says, Christian. He says, good, me too. What sub-denomination? He says, Baptist. He says, me too. He says, Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist? He says, Northern Baptist. He says, me too. He says, Northern Baptist Eastern region or Northern Baptist Western region? He says, Northern Baptist Eastern region. He says, me too. He says, Northern Baptist Eastern Region Charter of 1731 or Charter of 1842? He says, Charter of 1842. He says, die, heretic, and pushes him off the bridge. Right? Now, we know this is true. We're constantly dividing. Look, I have friends and family members who are also Jewish who rail against anti-Semitism, but then, make questionable racial comments. Or I know folks of color who rail against racism, but then make homophobic or heterosexist comments. And LGBTQ people who make comments about immigrants. Do any of you know anybody who done got something going on with somebody? This is the nature of how we think. And fear intensifies all of this. Fear intensifies us versus them thinking, and it intensifies bias. What happens is the fast part of our brain, when we're fearful, takes over. Daniel Goleman, who we associate with emotional intelligence, calls this an amygdala hijacking. The amygdala literally hijacks the brain and bathes our body with a cocktail of adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol, the stress chemicals. Puts us on high alert. And we do many things in this case, but one thing that we do is we look at situations for safety. And so we look at a situation when there's a whole group of people, but some of them are threatening. You might think about Islamophobia today as an example of this. We know that there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, and a tiny percentage who have engaged in any kind of terrorism. Of course, that terrorism is real. And so what the frightened mind says, it's too hard to figure out which of you are safe, so instead, I'm going to stay away from all of you. Hence, you have Americans who go along with the notion of keeping all Muslims out of the country, even though that's fundamentally contrary to the way our Constitution is written. Because fear justifies. And this is the nature of how this all plays out. So how does this impact belonging, our sense of belonging? And this is really important to know, and I want to just for clarification of language, my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Janetta Cole, likes to say that diversity is when you get invited to the party. Inclusion is when you get to dance. I would say belonging is when you actually get to choose the music. You see, very different for somebody to have to work to be successful inside of my culture. And I'm speaking now as a white man, a white, straight, cis man, That for somebody to have to say, okay, wow, you're really good at doing things the way we do them, and therefore you can be successful here, versus us really evaluating whether the culture itself is inclusive of everybody, whether the culture itself reflects everybody's music. And so belonging, we're realizing, is actually central to human being survival. And by belonging, by the way, I want to characterize 5 different elements. The first is we have some shared identity. You know, that we see ourselves as some collective. You know, the second is that we have a sense of shared destiny, and that is what happens to you may also happen to me. I'll give you an example of this. I was with a dear friend and colleague of mine who's an African-American woman the night that the story came out about Ferguson, when Michael Brown was killed. And we were watching it together. We've done diversity work together for years. We were both upset and outraged one more time, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point, our conversation drifted into the different ways we were relating to it. You see, I could be outraged and concerned about it, and I was. I do want to do something about it. But Rosalind had 2 grandsons who were the exact same age as Michael Brown. And for her, this could happen to her babies. And this is one of the things that's so important for those of us who are allies and want to be allies to know, is that being an ally is incredibly important, but it's also incredibly important to know as allies that we will never, no matter how much we care, no matter what our intentions are, we will never experience the issue, or almost never experience the issue in the same way as the people who we're trying to ally with. And we can become arrogant sometimes as allies to think that our intention covers that up, but it doesn't. We always have to keep listening in that regard. Another is a sense of interdependence. What happens to you affects what happens to me. Some sense of shared values. That doesn't mean we agree about everything, but we agree about generally a way to operate with each other. And then finally, usually in communities of belonging, we feel more free to be ourselves. And most of you have had this opportunity. You've got a group of people who you've been together with maybe in your dorm for 4 years, or somebody who you went to school with in college and you've been together in a group for 20 years, or a book group, or your family, or something else. We have that sense of belonging. People in non-dominant groups often have a sense of belonging with each other. This is why when African Americans pass each other on the street, the nod happens. It's kind of like, we're in this together, right? You know, and so this happens in lots of different ways. Now, why is belonging important to organizational life? Because we know that people who feel a sense of belonging perform at a higher level, more creative and innovative, more inclusive, less likely to leave, more likely to represent the organization positively, more likely to treat customers and stakeholders well, which all leads to greater success and profitability, whether you're a college, university, business, or baseball team. All in the same way. Now, one of the things that the research has shown us is that we actually have undervalued this. You know, most of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, I'm sure. You know, Abraham Maslow postulated this back, 75 years ago, one of the most central models in modern psychology. What we're now finding, and what Maslow basically said was there's a hierarchy of needs, and one is more preeminent than the other. So in essence, to break it down, he's saying if you're starving to death, you're not going to be sitting around contemplating life, you're going to be out searching for food. Said simply. It turns out that Maslow may have been wrong, that belonging may be more important to us than anything. And it makes sense if you think about it. What's the most vulnerable time of a human being's existence? An infant, right? If we don't belong to somebody for the first couple of years of our lives, we die. And so the first imprint we get is, I exist because you exist. This is why we're so impacted by the groups around us. And it makes, and it shows up too, being excluded from a group triggers activity in the same regions of the brain, the dorsal posterior insula, that's associated with physical pain. This is why almost every time one of these horrible incidents happen, like Sandy Hook or this one recently in Aurora, what's the first word you almost always hear used to describe the perpetrator? Loner, right? That pain of social isolation leads to that kind of behavior. It's also one of the reasons why some studies show as many as 4 times as many gay teenagers commit suicide, because in that case, the break in belonging might even be with my own family. And we know even things like addiction. Bruce Alexander is a Canadian psychologist who studies addiction. And he found that, normally the protocol they use for addiction studies is they put rats in little cages like this with a bottle of morphine for 57 days. And the rat gets addicted. Then they put him in another environment and see whether the addiction sticks. And lo and behold, most times it does. And Alexander said, well, if you put me in a cage with nothing to do but suck on this bottle every day, I'd probably want to numb myself out too. So what if we put the rats in a different environment? And he created these things he called rat parks. Big, expansive areas with lots of different rats together, while in the experiment, toys to play with and the like, did the exact same experiment. And look at the difference. These are the addiction levels in the first, these are the addiction levels in the second. See, this is one of the reasons why 12-step programs are so powerful for people, because it creates a community that I can belong to in which I feel accepted. I can feel like I can be myself. I don't have to pretend. That's why the rate of recidivism rate for people who participate in 12-step programs regularly is dramatically less than those who try to make it on their own. So how does this affect us in terms of social conformity? Well, let's take a look at what happens when we're confronted with group.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do?
Yeah, we laugh like we don't do the same thing. You know, now we maybe don't stand up with a bell, but you go out. Some of you'll go out tonight and you'll say to yourself, we go out with some friends. You say to yourself, I'm not going to have anything to drink tonight. Until everybody else orders a drink, then what are you going to do, right? Or you're sitting around talking about somebody who you're really positive about, but before you get to weigh in, 4 other people in the conversation trash that person. You notice you're a little more hesitant with your praise. In fact, I want to ask you this just to raise your hand. How many of you ever found yourself agreeing with something that you don't really agree with in order to get along with a group of people? Tell the truth, right? How many people have ever done anything you wouldn't normally do because you were with a group of people who were doing it? Now, sometimes that's positive. Sometimes we get exposed to new behavior. How many have ever questioned your own point of view about something because everyone around you felt differently, right? How have you ever assumed that something was just so because a lot of other people said it was so, right? This is, in fact, what's going on around us. And so I want to look at this briefly from the standpoint of the political divide. This is what our political culture looked like according to Pew, Pew is generally pretty, dependably nonpartisan in the way they approach things. I know people on the extremes don't necessarily believe so, but it's been tested out pretty well. This is what it looked like, and basically this is what our culture has been like politically for a long time, almost like a bell curve. And there were people on the ends, but mostly we were issue-oriented and we reached across the aisle when we found people. So famously, Orrin Hatch, the most conservative member of the Senate, and Teddy Kennedy, the most liberal member, teamed up on education reform. Or Joe Biden and John McCain and Russ Feingold teamed up on campaign finance reform. And for the most part, historically, this is the way it worked. But watch what happens over a period of the last 20-plus years. The same study. We've moved from a bell curve to a dumbbell curve, where everything's on the end and nothing's in the middle. And it's now considered to be not only not great, but bad if you associate with the other side. Joe Biden a few weeks ago said he actually had friends who were Republicans. Some people said that disqualified him from being a presidential candidate for the Democrats. The same thing happened. Remember when Chris Christie, after Hurricane Sandy, in that picture, put his arm around President Obama, killed his presidential chances for a lot of people. So, and not only have we divided politically, but the political lines are now drawn very strongly around race and identity, which wasn't always the case. Because historically, for example, Southern Democrats were more conservative up until Nixon's Southern strategy, the late 1960s and early 70s, and Republicans were seen as more liberal, especially on issues of race. After all, the party of Lincoln, right? Now we see it's identity-based. And when we evaluate people based on issues, it's impersonal. When we evaluate people based on identity, we objectify them. It's no longer, I disagree with you about gun rights, it's now you're one of those kind of people. And because of that out-group homogeneity effect that I talked about earlier, if you're one of those kind of people, I know that you believe this, 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 and this, and this, and this. And we know, of course, that life is a continuum. It doesn't actually exist this way. So we're living in a false reality about this. And when I say living, also where we're physically living. The Cook Political Report created back in 1992 what they called the Whole Foods Cracker Barrel divide. Because people who live around Whole Foods markets, not surprisingly, tend to be more liberal, because that's where they put the markets. People in Cracker Barrel family restaurant areas tend to be more conservative. When they started it in 1992, there was about a 21% difference. In other words, people in the Whole Foods areas, 21% more Democrat. People in the Cracker Barrel, 21% more Republican. Watch what's happened over the next 6 elections. In the last election, it was 54%. That means that we're now living around each other. People like us, we go to the store with them, we go to the hairdresser or the barbershop with them. Our kids go to school with people similar. We're surrounded by people like us. And therefore, we don't see what other people see. This especially shows up around race. When Pew studied race, do blacks suffer discrimination? The green dots are what whites said, the yellow dots are what blacks said. You can see the gap, 34%, 32%, 41%, et cetera. This is the belonging gap. And it also shapes how we interpret things. So these are 3 of the most controversial words in America today. And we know that there are very strong opinions on both sides about the words Black Lives Matter. But you see, we're actually talking not about 3 words, but about 4 words. But the 4th word is invisible, and it's different for each group. Some people see these 3 words and see this. Only Black Lives Matter. Other people see Black Lives Matter too. But we don't discuss that 4th word openly much. And so we assume we're seeing the same thing and interpreting it the same. And this is the challenge, is that we don't talk about it. And the media contributes tremendously to this. You know, when I grew up, we had 3 media sources. We had ABC, NBC, and CBS, basically, and they were all pretty much homogenized because they were speaking to the whole market, and they didn't want to exclude half the market share, not to mention the fact that it was considered to be unethical for news stations to have opinions in those days. And it's hard to believe now when 80% of what we see as news is punditry, right? And so we got the basic same information, but we interpreted it differently. Now we get pre-interpreted information. We don't even watch the news. We watch people watching the news. You turn on the news and you get your panel there that's interpreting it before you've ever heard the news itself. And it shows up, and fear is fed by what we're exposed to in this way. So I was working, when I was training at Harvard, somebody brought me these 2 stories that came out the same day in Iowa. 2 burglaries. The first one, 3 University of Iowa wrestlers arrested and suspended, right? The second one, same instance, a burglary. 4 arrested in Coralville burglary investigation. You see anything different about these pictures? Frat boys gone wild versus thugs. And it happens to us every day. This is a report from a Chicago news station.
Meantime, 2 teenagers are wounded on the city's south side. It happened at East 74th as an 18-year-old man and 16-year-old girl were hit while standing on the sidewalk. The male's in good condition while the girl's expected to recover. And kids on the street as young as 4 were there to see it all unfold and had a disturbing reaction.
No, I'm not scared of nothing.
When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
Because I live right here and I don't want none of my family members to get shot.
That is very scary indeed. So far, no suspects are in custody.
Yeah, very scary indeed, particularly to see this 4-year-old child already talking about getting a gun, right? Very upsetting. Let me show you something more upsetting. This is a video of the same interview with the 4-year-old child taken by a bystander with their cell phone.
That's what I like to hear. You ain't scared of nothing. Damn. When you get older, you gonna stay away from all these guns?
No.
No?
No.
What do you want to do when you get older?
I'm gonna have me a gun.
You are? Why you want to do that? You know what happens when...
I'm gonna be the police.
Okay, well then you can have...
Little different context, isn't it? But it didn't fit the reporter's narrative about young kid being trained to be a thug. What are you watching? See, we are participating in our own propagandizing. And we do it voluntarily by moving more and more and more into only getting certain information. Now, as somebody who is on the left of this conversation politically, of course I think people on the right do it more. Anybody I talk to on the right thinks people on the left do it more. I'm not saying they're necessarily equal, but there's plenty of both going on. But when we add to this, so now we see, we know we have different identities. We know that we live around people more than us. We watch the same news as them. Social media comes in because, of course, you have to unfriend that person who disagreed with you, right? And we keep adding layer after layer until we're living in these completely separate worlds. And every villain is a hero in their own story. It makes perfect sense over there. One of the things I've been doing is I've been reaching out across social media and trying to engage with people. And people who are different from me. And, if the conversation goes south and name-calling happens, I say, I'm getting out of here pretty quickly. But I find in an awful lot of cases, people really want to engage. And I've developed relationships with this one guy, Paul, who 2.5 years ago trolled me on a tweet. You liberals, blah, 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 blah. So I sent him a note, which I often do, said, be glad to have a civil conversation with you about this if you'd like. And to his credit, he said, sure. So we've been engaging now in debates for 2.5 years. And we go after each other on the issues. Never personal insults, but because I've actually grown to like the guy. I've talked to him on the phone a number of times. And by the way, I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about anybody. I'm not talking about David Duke or Richard Spencer or people like that. We've got to contain people like that, people who are on the extremes. I'm talking about the larger percentage of people who actually are available for conversation if we approach them in the right way. So he and I have been engaging in these conversations now for a long time, and he said to me not long ago, he said, I got to tell you something. I said, what's that, Paul? He says, I know we're on a phone call. He says, I know I frustrate you sometimes because you don't think you're changing my mind about anything, but I want you to know you've changed my mind about something really important. You've changed my mind about liberals. He said, I used to think liberals were all idiots, and that they, da-da-da-da. He says, now I see that that was all bias on my part. And while we may not agree on substance, I know that you're a good man. And then just 2 weeks ago when the shutdown was happening, we were in a debate on Twitter. One of his friends jumped in and started to insult me. You asshole, da-da-da-da, excuse my language, da-da-da-da. He jumps in and writes to this guy, don't you dare talk to my friend that way. He and I disagree on the substance, but he's a good man with integrity. You will not use my Twitter feed to insult him. See, there's possibility in that. I'm not saying you have to back off on your strongly held value. I promise you, I have strongly held political views. Anybody who follows me on social media will see that. I'm not afraid to share them either. But that doesn't mean that I think that anybody who disagrees with me is a demon. Because I know that had I grown up in their narrative, I would probably see the world pretty much like they do. And coming from that place, coming from recognizing the difference between our beliefs and our humanity, that they're distinct, can give us an opportunity to talk to people. I was trained by Saul Alinsky, the great labor organizer, And Saul used to tell us all the time. He said, if you want to change people's mind, you better understand their point of view better than they do. You better be able to get into their world. And how can we do that if we're only watching our news sources all the time? So here's the good news. There's stuff that we could do about this. So what can we do to break this cycle? I want to leave you with some hope and some things to go into action. The first is when we're dealing with a system, like something gets through. Starbucks is a good example. The incident in Philadelphia with Starbucks is a good example. We have to identify whether the challenges we're dealing with are special case or common case. Now, what I mean by that is this an aberrant behavior on the part of somebody, or is it something that the system is producing regularly? So we might take two circumstances, Starbucks and Chick-fil-A. Some of you know there was a boycott of Chick-fil-A a number of years ago because Chick-fil-A had corporate policies that we might call anti-gay, right? And they funded organizations that were anti-gay and all these kinds of things. So there was a boycott, and that made sense to me because the whole system was producing this result. Starbucks, on the other hand, was an interesting circumstance because one person did what she did in Philadelphia, one person out of 250,000 people. Now, so it raises the question, is this appropriate to boycott the whole organization? Because can any organization be depended upon to guarantee the behavior of 250,000 people? And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We each make our own determinations about that, but that's an important question for us to ask. Where is the breakdown coming from? If it's a special case, then it requires specific focused intervention. If it's a common case, it's more comprehensive systems intervention. The second is to start with yourself by understanding your own biases. Look, we all have them. I've been doing this work now. I've been paid for doing diversity and inclusion work for 35 years. I went to my first civil rights meeting when I was about 16 years old. So that's 52 years ago. I promise you, I've worked on myself more than almost anybody on the planet around these issues. I've done this forever, right? And last spring, I was coming back from Minneapolis, where I've been presenting at a conference, flew into Washington, D.C. with my wife, who's my business partner, and one of our colleagues. We walk up into the main terminal area, and standing before me, not 10 feet in front of me, is Dr. Martin Luther King's son, Martin Luther King III. And I have to acknowledge a fanboy moment. That's Martin Luther King III. So I went over to him, like so many people have done, and thanked him for trying to continue his father's work and acknowledged the impact his father had had on me. He couldn't have been more gracious, and we ended up taking a picture together. He was with two women, his wife, it turns out, and then another woman. And we went home. The next day, we had visitors come over, and my wife was saying, hey, we met Martin Luther King III yesterday. And I said, yeah, he was with his wife and his assistant. And Leslie, my wife, says to me, honey, he wasn't his assistant. She was his chief of staff. And I had to stop and say to myself, if that was a man, would I have assumed it was his assistant? Now, again, it had nothing to do with my intention. That was the way it occurred to me. So we always have to be looking inward about this, because every one of us is susceptible to that. And we might block out the person who's really willing to be an ally, really willing to be helpful, because they look like that, or because they said this word. And we're becoming very, kind of parsing words a lot too. Start watching, reading, and listening to other media sources. Now, when you watch that other media source, be careful not to have something you can throw at the screen of the TV. I'm not saying it will be fun. I'm not saying you have to do it all the time. But I promise you, it's incredibly illuminating. What we do is when things like big issues are going on, we flip between stations. We'll put on Fox, MSNBC, CNN, and BBC if it's available, BBC TV. Used to do Al Jazeera America when that was available. And sort of every 15 or 20 minutes switch. I tell you, it is mind-bending how differently these things are covered. And we begin to see how we're being conditioned and how they're being conditioned, whoever they are. To move from position taking to problem solving, and one way is to try on other people's points of view. See, we get so fixed and self-righteous about our point of view that we can't even listen to what's going on over there. And often, when we're listening to them, we might be able to find a way to tap into a solution that they could live with. But if we just shut them down and stereotype them, then it's almost impossible. And again, I'm not talking about people in the extremes now. I'm talking about the people you work with or the people in your family. Do you know thousands of families have canceled Thanksgiving dinner the last couple of years rather than be at the Thanksgiving dinner table with old Uncle Ernie because he voted differently than I did? Even though old Uncle Ernie was my favorite uncle growing up. I mean, that's sad. That we're even letting our family relationships be dominated by this. Another is to work from a set of principles and not just what makes you feel right. And there's a lot of that, the whataboutism that we're in now. Well, I'm doing what's wrong, but they did it first. And where does that lead us? The ends justify the means. At some point, I'm not saying we don't have to do what's rational to protect ourselves. Of course we do, but we also have to hold on. In philosophy, they call it deontology, to an approach that's based in our core values and stay consistent with our core values. Because if we give up our core values just to win, we've lost everything. To practice personal connection, vulnerability, and consciousness. Where this lives is opening oneself up. Now, this is important because in a lot of environments now we're afraid to talk about these issues. But we're actually finding people can be taught to talk about these issues in a constructive way. We're doing work with Target, for example. We bring hundreds of people together when the trans bathroom issue came up. Brought hundreds of people together to have courageous conversations about that and how people felt about it. When the Muslim ban came up at General Mills, had 400 people in the room, and gave them tools to be able to have these conversations so they could understand each other and understand different points of view. Now, we have to watch out for times when we're more committed to being right than to understand each other. And this is one of the traps that human beings fall into, to being right. And part of this is paying attention to how shame and guilt cloud our points of view. Because shame and guilt can drive. This is one of the challenges we had, the old style diversity training we used to do with the 2x4. We'd beat on people who looked like this until at some point they saw the error of their ways and cried, and everybody got a great cathartic rush out of that. But more times than not, they ended up wounded and therefore contracted. It may have made them less likely to do something egregiously wrong, but it also made them tremendously less likely to talk about race, for example. And if we're not talking about it, how are we going to ever deal with it? And then finally, then to also cultivate open-minded thinking, to consciously put yourself into another person's world. And again, none of this means letting go of your values or your point of view. It's just remembering that it's a point of view. See, the problem is not that we have strong points of view. The problem is we think our point of view is truth with a capital T, and theirs, therefore, is lies. Or ours is good with a capital G, and theirs is, therefore, evil. Sometimes it may live that way. But at least we need to be willing to explore, is there a rational way to do that? And then, of course, to understand our personal narrative, because what we notice is that if I grew up in your story, I would probably see the world just like you do, and vice versa. And so when we understand the personal narrative, we get a sense of where they're coming from. We don't cartoonize them anymore, make them into a caricature of an idea. We actually get to know the person. The more we know each other for who we are, the less we treat each other like what we are. Right? And then finally, to develop some tools. So I want to leave you, last thing I want to leave you with is a tool that you can use. Now this was, the original model for this was created by a woman named Elizabeth Lesser, excuse me, sorry. But I've adapted it slightly, but she calls it taking the other to lunch. Now, you may want to, when I get this up, feel free, I'll leave it up long enough so you can take pictures of this, because I want to invite you to actually try this, okay? It starts first by finding somebody you disagree with and you agree on ground rules, and that is we're not here to persuade, defend, or interrupt each other. The purpose of this conversation is to listen and understand each other, to get a sense of where you're coming from. That doesn't mean you can't later on try to convince them. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying for the purpose of this conversation, we do that. Thank you. Then once you've done that, you have that agreement, then you ask each other 4 questions, and it works really well if you kind of set time. So we're each going to have 7 minutes for this question so that one person doesn't dominate verbally. The first question is this: what are some of your life experiences that have led you to feel the way you do? So you get a sense of what their narrative was. So I'll give you an example. I did this with a white gay man and an African-American straight man who were in a public leadership forum that I was moderating, and the straight guy said at some point, in my church we believe homosexuality is a sin. The gay guy was offended and left the room and created a huge upset. So they started to share their stories. The gay guy started, and it was basically not an unusual story. He came out when he was a teenager. His parents were relatively supportive. He'd been with his partner for 17 years, had a couple of kids. You know, you've heard that story before, I'm sure, or a similar one. The other guy's story is fascinating. He grew up in a very poor and dangerous part of the Washington, D.C. area where I live. And he said when he was growing up, 4 or 5 of his friends growing up were killed by gang violence. And he said the only thing that saved me was the church. My mother insisted that I go to church starting from the time I was a choir boy. And I believed to the core of my soul, had I not done that, I would have ended up like them. And so he said, with tears in his eyes, he said, I don't question my pastor. It was almost like it lived for him like a Chinese puzzle. If he questioned anything, the whole thing would fall apart. And the other guy listened to this and he said, wow. He said, I still don't agree with your point of view, obviously. He said, but I can get growing up in that how you could end up there. Something shifted. Then the second question is, what is it about that other side that concerns you? What scares you about the other point of view? And this is important because fear is our prime human motivator. Fear drives most of our behavior, getting away from fear, feeling more comfortable. So they started to talk about that. And then the third one, which was really the funniest moment of this whole interaction, what are some questions that you've always wanted to ask someone from the other side? So at this point, the straight guy says to the gay guy, so when did you decide you were gay? And the gay guy responds, I don't know, when did you decide you were straight? And the guy's jaw dropped. He said, well, I didn't, I just was. He says, exactly. And then finally, the last one, which is really important, is there anything you'd like to say to clean up the past? Because when we have these moments of transformation, when we see something differently, we often are left with the burden of things we've done in the past that we're now embarrassed or ashamed of. And if we don't clean those up somehow, we're kind of dragging those into the future or finding a way to self-justify them. It stops us from moving forward. So when we own it, take responsibility for it and move on. I mean, think about it this way. 1992, they asked President Bill, or at that time candidate Bill Clinton, did you ever smoke weed in college? And he said famously what? Right, here we are 27 years later. You still know what he said, and it's a punchline for a joke, right? President Obama runs for president, and in his autobiography talks about smoking weed and doing cocaine. Non-issue. You see, when we own our stuff, we can move on from it. You know, and so this is so important. In this case, the straight guy says to the gay guy, he says, listen, he says, I know I'm still uncomfortable with all this, but I want you to know that I've sat in a room while people have told jokes and even participating in telling jokes about people like you. And I want you to know, first of all, that I apologize for that. I can see now how inappropriate that is. And I want you to know that you can count on me never to do that in the future. Now he was free of that past. He could move forward without carrying the burden of it. Now he's got to keep his word, of course. I'm not saying you can just say stuff. I'm saying you have to be in integrity with your word, but that helps us move forward. And then finally, be willing to acknowledge when you're wrong and apologize when you see it. because that's another thing that we're seeing going on right now a lot. We're afraid to let them know that we made a mistake. And so we keep justifying. In psychology, they call it the backlash effect. No matter how obvious it is that it was wrong, we'll find some way to continue to justify it. And John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist, once said, most human beings, given a strongly held point of view and evidence to the contrary, will quickly go about refuting the evidence. And we've seen that happen so much, haven't we, when other people do it? Not so much when we do, of course. Right? And then, getting outside of ourselves for a moment, the last piece is that we need to create communities of support because we can't do this by ourselves. It's almost impossible to eliminate our biases if we don't have people around us who are willing to bring them to our attention, especially the deeper ones, the most unconscious ones. White supremacy is the world I grew up in. I was trained in that world. That world of entitlement and privilege that allows me to do things and be related to a particular way as a white man. I didn't choose it. I don't like it. But nonetheless, it shows up on a regular basis. And if I don't have people in my world who are women, who are people of color, who are other people, or even other white guys sometimes, who are willing to say, hey, I know you don't intend this, but let me tell you how that behavior you just engaged in shows up. If I don't have people in that world, I'm not going to see it most of the time. Because I was trained to do it for, almost 70 years. And I'm being trained today to do it. This is the world we live in. It doesn't mean, one of the mistakes we make sometimes is we turn some of these systemic issues, and white supremacy or white privilege or entitlement is a good example of that, we turn it into a personal phenomenon, like you are this. And of course, when I'm attacked that way, I'm going to be defensive. But it's actually a systemic issue that shows up personally. It's a little bit like a rainstorm. It's not a personal rainstorm, but you get personally very wet in it, right? And if we can help people see that, it's much easier for people to see it when it's not attacking them so personally. And again, I'm not talking about David Duke and Richard Spencer. I'm talking about the people who you live with every day, who it's unlikely they wake up every morning and say, how can I suppress women and people of color today? That's not the way it mostly shows up. So I want to leave you with a story. Some of you may be familiar with the story. It was written by a guy named Lauren Isley, who's a science writer. And the way the story goes, Isley's out on the beach one morning and he's walking, and in the distance he sees a young man dancing. He thinks he's dancing anyway. As he gets closer, he realizes he's not dancing at all. He's tossing things into the water. And as he gets closer still, he looks at the beach, and there are literally thousands of starfish that have been washed up by the tide. And it's now morning sun. And he says to the guy, what are you doing? And the guy says, well, all these starfish have been washed up on the beach. And if they're left out in the morning sun for too long, they'll die. So I'm tossing them back in the water so that they can survive. And Isley looks to his left and looks to his right at all these hundreds of thousands of starfish, and he says, you can't possibly think, there's so many of them, you can't possibly think it makes a difference. The young man reaches down and he says, made a difference to that one. You see, the breakthrough starts with our ability to take it on ourselves, to talk to your roommate, to talk to your mother, your father, your Uncle Ernie, to talk to that other professor who disagrees with you, whoever it is for you, to start, if necessary, one by one to building these bridges. We're citizens of a democracy. We are responsible for the government that we have. And too many of us are sitting around bemoaning how bad it is now and not getting active. Now, I know this afternoon you're going to get a great talk about social activism and how this plays out, and that's a critical part of this conversation. But it also lives one-on-one. And when we begin to understand each other, we move from, why do you see it that way, to, why do you see it that way? And that movement from fear to curiosity can create a world in which we all belong. Thank you all so much. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have time. How much time do we have for questions?
Yes, we do have time for questions. Howard, thank you so much for that. I was watching some of the tweets, and somebody said, you are killing it with this keynote. So yes, indeed, you killed it with the keynote. So we're going to start and see if Alex has any tweeted questions for you, and then we invite the rest of you to line up at the microphones to pose questions to Howard.
Hello.
Hi, Alex.
So, while this issue is not something that has been discussed in your talk today, folks on Twitter want to know more about your perspective on UNT's relationship with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, and police. Folks on Twitter, nope. That was not me silencing the clapping. You can welcome to clap. Folks on Twitter have tweeted about violence perpetrated by these agencies, including the death of migrant trans women in ICE custody, miscarriages of women in ICE custody, and children in cages. I think many people are wondering what Angelica at Denton Dame asked, does ICE, CBP, being invited to UNT facilitate a safe learning and workplace environment for immigrants, particularly immigrants of color? Have you worked with other campuses on this issue, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so to be transparent, I haven't worked specifically with campuses on those issues, but I have worked with other groups around these issues, including some people in the government. I think one of the things we have to recognize is context is everything in terms of how we see the world. And we look at some of the agencies that we look at in the world, and we can see how these agencies, how we feel about these agencies is determined by what the agency is doing. So right now, for example, a lot of folks on the left are really jumping in to kind of defend the FBI because it's under attack from the right. Well, most of my life as a social justice organizer and operator, the FBI was not something people on the left defended. But now all of a sudden some people are doing that because the context has shifted. And I think we have to recognize that our relationship with immigration is being deeply shaped, obviously, you all know this, by the rhetoric in our environment. When we start to talk about people leaving dangerous environments and trying to come into our country, which is, of course, what the Statue of Liberty was all about, right? Giving you're tired, you're poor, you're humble, waiting to be free. That's what we're supposed to be about as a country, but instead they're invaders. And not only are they invaders, but one person over here did this, and another person over here did this, and we magnify the negativity of them. It's not surprising that the behavior of people who are interacting with those people becomes more violent, becomes less personal, becomes less empathetic, and the kinds of things we see. So I'm all for questioning whether or not these agencies are viable and whether or not they're operating in the right way or whether or not their role is necessary. And this is some of the conversations that I've been engaging in with people. But the bigger question is, if we don't change that context, if we don't change that rhetoric, if we don't change the container it's happening in, even if we get rid of ICE, there's going to be somebody else doing the same thing. Right? You all know this, right? Knowing the right things to do is not always the answer. I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room who struggled with his weight at one point or another. And yet how many of us, when we're heavy, know exactly what we need to do to lose weight? We just don't do it. Right? Because we don't know why we do it. So I think we always want to look at both, and we want to look at what's actually being done, and are there better ways to produce the result, the noble result that's behind that, and secondly, how is the context shaping what's going on? Okay. Another question?
That's all I've got. That's all I've got
okay,
back here. Most of the Twitter conversation that's going on in the back channel is conversations about ICE and CBP right now.
Oh, okay, good. All right. Somebody's coming.
I'm wondering, having worked with all the Fortune companies, some of your advice from all of your learnings and workings, and for us in the workplace. I've worked at places where they wanted us to have a certain amount of candidates that we interviewed from different demographics. So it was this forced conversation. And then I've had times where we interviewed people and I didn't have a chance to look them up in LinkedIn, and I had someone with the name Haley show up who was a man. And, so
right.
I loved that time because we had this great diverse pool without being told to have that. So I'm just wondering, in the workplace, what are some things we can do, take the learnings and make sure that we're being inclusive?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think first of all, we have to recognize that for the most part, we talked about this in the conversation that Shani and I were having just a few minutes ago. Diversity is done in a really interesting way in the workforce, different than almost anything that I know. We do diversity as a series of events often, more times than not actually. And so we have diversity training, we have Black History Month or Women's History Month, we have International Food Day in the cafeteria, and then we check off diversity. Very different than we would do any other serious issue in the workplace. We do a safety initiative, for example. You look at how safety impacts every aspect of the company. When you're looking for quality, you look at how quality impacts every aspect of the company. And yet for some reason with diversity, we see it just as a list of events. And so one of the things we need to do is we have to create greater centrality of diversity as one of the lenses we look through. I kind of think of it this way. When I was growing up and just getting into the world of work, now, 45 years ago or more, a lot of companies had a computer guy. And it really was a computer guy, and they really did have those pencil pockets. Right? And if anything came up with computers in the business, you went to the computer guy. Right? Now we know that everything we do runs through technology. And you can't function in this school, for example, if you don't know how to function on technology. It's like a whole nother lens that we look through and filter everything we do. We need to move diversity to that level, first of all. We need to get to the level where we're really seeing that, that this impacts virtually everything we do. And then we get much more granular. We say, okay, how do we educate people? What are some systems that we put in so that we can prime behavior so that they remember their education when they need it? So somebody can participate in the best unconscious bias training in the world, but if they don't have to do a performance review for 4 months, what are the odds that they'll remember what they learned? But if just before they go into that performance review, they take a couple of minutes to be reminded of a few critical points, it's amazing how it regenerates itself. We have to look at our structures and systems. Are there better ways to do hiring processes? Are there better ways to grade students? Are there better ways to do interviews? So we can really get structural and look, and there are ways that we know that mitigate bias. We know one of them that a lot of you know is using what they call blind resumes. So removing some of the personal information from resumes so things like names don't impact people in the way some of the studies we saw. Now, one of the challenges was that with any idea is dangerous if it's the only one you have, right? And so that can also create blind spots. So for example, let's say I've got 2 guys. I'm going to use DC geography because I know DC geography where I grew up and where I live. 2 guys. One of them grew up in Potomac, Maryland, which is the high rent district. Right? Mom was a doctor. Dad was a lawyer. So had built-in tutoring at home. If he ever needed a tutor like that, he got the tutor. Didn't have to work to contribute to the family because, of course, his parents were plenty wealthy. And they really wanted him to participate in extracurriculars. So he was on a debate team and student government and went on Habitats for Humanities trips and played soccer, the whole bit, right? A great resume. SATs come around. He took not only 1, but 2 SAT prep courses and had a private SAT tutor and took the SAT test 2 or 3 times to make sure that he could get his scores up. And so lo and behold, he ends up with a 4.4 adjusted grade point average and high SATs. The other one grows up in Anacostia, which is a low-income part of the city. He grew up inside of a single-parent home where his mom or dad, whichever parent it was, worked 2 jobs to support he and his 2 younger siblings. Mom or dad left at 7 in the morning, didn't come back till 9 at night. So in the morning, he would wake up and he would get his siblings ready for school, feed them breakfast, drop them off at school, go to school himself, pick them up after school, drop them off at daycare, then go to his part-time job that he did to help support the family, picks his sibs up at 6 o'clock at the end of the day, takes them home, feeds them dinner, helps them with their homework, and then when mom or dad comes home at 9 o'clock, he does his homework finally and goes to sleep, does the same thing the next day and the next, until the weekends when he worked all day on part-time jobs, right? No time for extracurriculars. SAT time came around, didn't have the money or maybe the access to SAT prep courses and certainly couldn't afford a tutor and could not afford to take more than 1 day off work to take the SAT. He ends up somehow, despite all of that, with a 3.6 and SAT scores that are 150 points lower. Who's the best candidate, right? Now, without knowing that backstory, you wouldn't know that what it took for him in the face of all that to be a 3.6 may be more impressive than what it did for the other kid to be a 4.4. And I'm not even including the quality of the school that they might be in. Yeah, and God only knows how many hundreds of factors. So we want to be careful when we look at those systems we put in place that we're not solving one problem to create a new one. And then the last is to find ways to measure what we're doing. Because often with organizations, the only measurement we have is how many are there, which doesn't really help us much. But if we break them down into batches, I shared earlier one example, a client of mine that has a target of 40%, hiring 40% women. Well, first of all, actually, I want to talk about diversity targets, because a lot of times when we set goals around diversity, set goals around diversity, you hear, oh my God, are we talking about quotas? Quotas are not goals, right? Quotas mean, okay, we have to have 40%, so no matter whether people are qualified or not, we're going to put them in. Goals mean we're targeting 40%. It's our job to go out and meet that goal. So let's say we have four metrics that we batch together. The first is how many people apply for jobs, How many people are offered jobs, how many people accept the jobs, and how many people are successful after 6 months. Because I like to say, who cares if you hire them, if they're not successful after 6 months, it's a waste of everybody's time, right? So only 20% apply for jobs. We know we need to spread the net wider. We need to reach out there and tap into more communities that represent that group. 40% apply, but only 20% are offered. Well, then it's likely two things are happening. One of two things are happening. Either you're getting the wrong people to apply, or there's something differential in your hiring system. 40% are offered, but only 20% accept, then something is not turning them on to come to your organization. And maybe it's turning them off. So maybe we'll go to our ERG and we'll say, could you look at this process and see what might be turning people off here, right? Let's say 40% accept but only 20% are successful. Then we need to look at what happens when they enter the organization. But you can see this allows us to get more granular to identify the breakdowns. So those are just a couple of quick ideas. Okay, I think we have somebody over here.
I think it's on.
Sure.
I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much. I really enjoyed just listening for understanding.
Thank you.
My question is, it's tied to something that Alex shared from Twitter. What advice do you have for those of us interested in addressing the fears of our Latinx students and staff, that population, as they learn of the opportunities that are extended to organizations like ICE to visit campus, to engage in job fairs, or in any other capacity?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important question. I mean, I think we start with the importance of allyship. You know, there's that incredible poem that was written by a minister named Martin Niemöller. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It was written during times of Nazi Germany, where he says, first they came for the Jews, and then I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the gypsies, I wasn't a gypsy, and finally they came for me, and there was nobody to say anything, right? We have to realize this is not happening to Latinx students, it's happening to all of us. It's happening to the fabric of our culture. And we have to take this personally. And that means both letting people know they have support when they may feel isolated, they might feel like they don't have a place to belong. That includes standing up and saying something, so it's not just people always having to stand up for themselves, because a lot of times when people have to stand up for themselves, it becomes one more tool of oppression. You know, for example, a woman raises the specter of a gender dynamic, and the reaction is, oh God, we have one of those feminazis around. You know, so it's important for those of us who aren't members of those groups to speak out as well. It's important for us to understand collectively the issue and to look what we could do about it and to organize ourselves around the issue. And it's important where it's necessary to speak truth to power and challenge the systems and structures that we don't think are serving us. And if you believe if we believe that the institution we're a part of is supporting that group by giving them access or a voice, then it's completely appropriate to stand up against that. You know, one of the challenges we have is we live, as I said earlier, we're living in this incredible bath of misconception. And it's amazing. I know some of all of you see it. You know, it's amazing the things that people think as truth that are complete nonsense. You know, but it shows up. And then finally, as an ally, what I said earlier, it's important for us to know that we can't be in their experience. We can try to understand their experience, and we should. We can do everything we can to reach out and let people know that we're supporting, but we always have to be listening to how is it affecting them and not come in to save them. This is one of the things that happened to a lot of us during the civil rights movement. Now, I was just a kid, really, you know, because I was born in 1951, but a lot of the white allyship in the civil rights movement was people were here to help those poor black people. And this is why when the whole Black Power movement take over, one of the first things they did is say, get the hell out of here. And white people's feelings were hurt because, of course, you know, we were nice people. We were trying to do the right thing, but we didn't even realize that the way we were interacting was within the power structure as it existed. We still were being supremacists in the way we were handling that. Like, we're here to help you. You know. So those are a couple thoughts off the top of my head. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Howard, we've got another question on another topic from Twitter.
This question is from Aaron Carey at AaronCarey0 on Twitter. And Aaron asks, Howard Ross, are there any tools or exercises to widen our own lens?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I think that that's each of our responsibility. And it starts with connecting with people who disagree with us. finding people in your, this is the value of diversity. This is why, going to a campus like this where you've got so much more racial, cultural diversity than a lot of people, do you have an incredible opportunity to engage with people who are different from you. It's a huge, huge asset. And sometimes we take it for granted. And it takes consciousness. Consciously interacting with people who are different from you is not tokenism. Getting into really meaningful conversations with people who are different from us sometimes requires conscious action because we live in a world that's so naturally segregated in which the normal way of operating is segregated. And so that's one piece of it. Finding yourself different expressions from different cultures or different points of view. The arts, for example. Books, stories, movies. I was sharing earlier that I used to do this thing when before I had my iPad and everything was on my iPad that I read, where before I got on an airplane, I would go into the magazine shop and I'd pick the top right-hand magazine, whatever it was, and I'd read that while I was on the airplane. And sometimes it wasn't even in English. Sometimes it was in Spanish or something. But it didn't matter because I still got a sense of where people are coming from. So it might be Popular Mechanics or Women's Day or whatever, I kind of avoided Playboy when that was the one, but but you get my drift. I mean, we got to put ourselves in each other's world, and being open-minded requires consciousness because we are not naturally open-minded as human beings as much as we may want to think we are. We're not. Most of us are self-generating. Like I said earlier, we're not rational, we're rationalizing. So I think that those are a few things we could do. And sometimes it's a personal relationship that gets us there, but it's important to remember that if this personal relationship was with somebody who is the only one of a group that you've ever engaged with, the first Vietnamese person that you've ever engaged with, to be careful because that's rife for stereotyping. It's very easy for the mind to say, okay, now all Vietnamese people feel what this person did. So, a few thoughts.
Got one more question, okay. And then as long as you make your question short and you make your answer short.
Okay, will do. Thank you. She knows me now.
Sure. Okay, hopefully I explain this in the best way I can, but what do you think is the best way for someone to get out of their native narrative? Like, for example, how would you get someone away from their household? Like, is it our job to go and, save them necessarily? Or how would you, like for example, I've seen documentaries of, people growing up in a cult and they don't know anything else. Like, how do we get where we are, where people are so diverse and...
Yeah, it's great. Well, first of all, I would say it depends kind of which side of dominance you come from. It's different. People who are in non-dominant groups generally have easy exposure to people in a dominant group. And a lot of times I find that, for example, people of color know a lot more about white behavior culturally than white people do. Because we don't see ourselves as a group. Because being in a dominant group, we just don't have that consciousness. There's no white behavior. I'm really different from John. He grew up in Salt Lake City and I grew up in New York. And there are differences, but there's still this commonality. So when you're in a dominant group, I think it's incredibly important we find opportunities to immerse ourselves in places where we're not in the dominant group. So I've had the blessing of having some remarkable experiences. I talked about being on the Diversity Advisory Board for the Human Rights Campaign. Teaching at Bennett College was amazing. I was the only white man on that campus, And what I've noticed about myself is, or in my own personal experience, is that when I'm with most mixed groups, diverse groups, the culture is usually the dominant culture. So usually male culture, white culture, et cetera, is predominant when there's mixed groups. It's only when I'm one of the only white people that I get to really experience what or the only straight people or whatever, that I really get to experience what that culture is. So putting ourselves in those circumstances. Getting out of our world here and realizing what the rest of the world is doing with. I've been to Indian villages, spent a good deal of time in villages in India and in other places of the world, in Asia and other places. You begin to realize that we've got this incredible view of the way the world is, which is just very limited. And other people experience it very differently. But it starts with curiosity. It starts really with being curious about others and recognizing that, as I said before, every villain is a hero in their own story. Now, the big challenge is, can we do that with those folks on the other side of the political spectrum? One of the things I did for our search for belonging, because I know I live so much on the left, and I live in a Washington, D.C. suburb where I think 78% of our county went for Secretary Clinton. I went on an interview of over 100 people who voted for President Trump. And what I found out was my stereotypes didn't always hold up. Yeah, there were some people who fit the stereotype, but 56% of them said that they didn't even support him. They voted for him just because they didn't want to vote for her. A lot of them said that they didn't like certain aspects of them, but they had one issue. Maybe it was abortion or gun rights. Or one young woman who I've known since she was 13 years old homeschools her children, and she felt for some reason that Hillary Clinton was hostile to homeschooling, so that was the issue. And what I realized that there's this continuum, just like there is on the left, just like there were lots of people who were enthusiastically for Clinton, and there were other people who held their nose and voted for her because they just couldn't vote for Trump. And so the more we do that, the more we bring curiosity to the conversation. Again, I'm not saying you have to let go of your point of view, but bring curiosity. Okay? Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Howard.